الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين صلى الله وسلم عليك يا رسول الله صلى الله وسلم عليك يا أبا عبد الله يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة يا ليتنا كنا معكم سيدي فنفوز فوزا عظيما. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لقد كان في يوسف وإخوته آيات للسائلين. صدق الله العلي العظيم وصلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Dear brothers and sisters, elders, scholars and guests, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Chapter number 12 in the Quran, Surah Yusuf, is said to have been revealed when a group of Jewish scholars asked a group of Meccan idolaters to ask the Prophet Muhammad upon some details of the life of Yusuf. And the response was this revelation, which, by the way, when you read, is the only chapter which relates a story of any figure in a chronological form. So you notice the stories of the other prophets, such as Isa or Ibrahim or Musa, there is mention in different chapters. However, with Surah Yusuf, it is one remembrance, and it is remembered in a chronological fashion as well, in the same way that a story is mentioned. And it is unique. Chapter 12 is unique in this regard. So the reply came in the form of a revelation. And this corresponds with what you read today in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, chapters 37 to 46. And it was common for those who were skeptical about the message of Islam in the beginning to ask the Prophet certain details about figures from the past, such as Yusuf or such as Ibrahim. And sometimes you find some verses which begin with the word يَسْأَلُونَكَ, meaning they ask you. And usually these come from either from within the outside the Muslim community, that they are asking the Prophet about certain details, or sometimes from within the Muslim community, some of the companions of the Prophet would ask certain details about certain things which were revealed in the Quran. And what is interesting is, even though the Prophet revealed to them these details, many of them still did not want to accept Islam and the message of Islam. And the Quran says, وَجَحَدُوا بِهَا وَاسْتَيْقَنَتْهَا أَنفُسُهُم, that truly on the inside they had yaqeen, they knew that there was conviction, they had conviction, they knew that it was the truth. وَجَحَدُوا بِهَا وَاسْتَيْقَنَتْهَا أَنفُسُهُم. However, they fought against it, even though deep down they knew that it was the truth, for whatever reason. Sometimes we're revealed the truth, but we don't accept it because for instance, our ego does not allow us to accept it. Such was the case with many of those who came in contact with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And what's interesting is that some made the claim during that time that the Prophet was taught, he was mu'allam. He was taught by people of earlier traditions, and this is where the revelation came. And if you look at Orientalism, and Orientalism is the study of Near East religions, and something which has been around for the past few centuries. In the late 70s, there were a number of Oriental scholars that, through their own study, came to a number of conclusions. one group of Orientalists came to the conclusion that everything that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said was taken from scholars of Christianity and Judaism. And so he came up with his own religion where he took pieces from here and from there, and he put that together and came up with the religion of Islam. Now, we're not going to sit and refute everything that they said because that's an entire lecture series. In fact, some of them themselves, they walked away from their earlier suggestions. They abandoned their own thesis because they saw that it was false. Number one, we talk about the Prophet being illiterate, meaning what? Meaning that he was not taught. And it's important to understand this, that teaching, literacy, reading, writing, in today's world, it is an obligation upon every parent to send their child to school. If you don't send your child to school, you can get in trouble. In those days, this wasn't the case. So when we look at it in retrospect, we need to take it into consideration that learning to read and write was a privilege. It was not a right. That's why many people did not read and write. So it's not considered something against the Prophet that he did not read and write. In fact, it is actually considered for him that he did not read and write, meaning that he did not take his teachings from anybody else. Because the opinion is that he read and he wrote, and he read this in earlier scriptures, and he just put something together on his own. Well, taking into consideration that he was illiterate, this is impossible. Where would he read if he did not know how to read? What scriptures would he read? So that debunks that claim that the Prophet had taken his faith from other people. Even with all of that, they would still ask the Prophet questions. And so it is said that chapter number 12, Surah Yusuf, is one of those cases where they asked him about some of the details of the life of Yusuf, and he related through the revelation. When you look at the personality of the Prophet Yusuf as is related in the Quran, number one, Yusuf represents a figure of divine beauty. He was known as a figure of divine beauty, not only in the way that he looked, his physical appearance, because his physical appearance was remarkable. The Quran says that when he walked among the women, that Zulaykha, the woman who had made advances on him, that had tried to seduce him and make advances on him, when he resisted those advances and people began to point fingers at her and blame her, she invited them, and when he walked amongst them, what did they say? They said, قُلْنَا حَاشَ لِلَّهِ مَا هَذَا بَشَرًا إِنْ هَذَا إِلَّا مَلَكٌ كَرِيمٌ. This is not an earthly being. Bashar is someone who is created of the earth. This is not an earthly being. Truly this is Malak, meaning that he is an angel. He's come from the sky. But not only physically did he portray physical beauty, but also he portrayed spiritual beauty. And he was a model for patience at times of adversity. Now, how did he exhibit that patience? What was his character? What was his behavior? Number one, we find that Yusuf took a proactive instead of a reactive response. What does that mean? For most of our lives, we don't take a proactive response to our life. We take a reactive response to our life. Meaning what? Meaning that we wait for tragedies to happen for us to react. Instead of focusing on what can I do right now in my life so that I prevent bad things from happening. And by the way, bad things happening it's inevitable. It doesn't mean that if we take a proactive approach that everything is going to be fine and dandy. But you can become a more effective person if you learn to be proactive rather than reactive. For instance, very, very simple example of being proactive rather than reactive. Some people, they don't care about what they eat. They don't watch what they eat. They'll eat everything. And then, finally, when they end up in the hospital, they realize that now it's time to change. And maybe that works. Maybe, our bodies work in a very spectacular way. Our bodies can always rebuild themselves when we give up bad habits such as smoking or eating, our body can always rebuild itself. But that's a reactive approach. A proactive approach is when you don't engage in unhealthy behavior in the first place, so that you don't have to go to the doctor specifically for that. That is a proactive approach. And if you list the things in your life that you can take a proactive approach instead of a reactive approach, it'll amaze you how many problems and how many obstacles you can overcome. This works for students as well. Some students, they know that their teacher may be lenient with them, so they don't study for the test. They get a bad grade, and then sometimes the teacher feels bad for them and says, okay, I'll give you extra credit after this. That's a reactive approach. A proactive approach is study in the first place and get a good grade so that you don't have to go through the headache. Your parents don't have to go through the headache. Your teachers and principals don't have to go through that headache. So we anticipate things before they happen, and this requires foresight. In the case of our faith, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, it is clear in the Quran, those who do good, what their outcome will be, and those who do bad and evil, what their outcome will be. فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَهُ وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَهُ. He who puts out in the amount of a mustard seed of good, it shall return to him. Meaning sometimes we look at these deeds, and I spoke about this a little yesterday in passing, but these minor deeds that we do, these good deeds, you never know how it's going to return to you, either in your life or in the afterlife, or in the lives of your children and your grandchildren, or all three of them sometimes. Just because we receive a reward in this life doesn't mean that God is not going to reward us in the next life. In the same way, sometimes we do things which cause torment and punishment for ourselves in this life and also in the next life. This is apparent from the verses of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَأْكُلُونَ أَمْوَالَ الْيَتَامَى ظُلْمًا إِنَّمَا يَأْكُلُونَ فِي بُطُونِهِمْ نَارًا وَسَيَصْلَوْنَ سَعِيرًا. Two things. One, in this life, they are consuming fire in their stomachs, and one is in the hereafter, سَيَصْلَوْنَ. That is a verb which is in the future tense. سَيَصْلَوْنَ سَعِيرًا. So there is torment, meaning that, what's the torment in this life? You know, they're not going to feel the burning in their stomachs, but that money that they take from the orphans unjustly, and this was a problem which persisted before you didn't have social security services that looked after children if they lost their parents. Normally children, and even in today in many Islamic countries, children, when they lose their parents, they go into the care of family members. And sometimes, and many of you have probably seen this, sometimes those family members, they don't look after the children, the orphans, in the way that they should. I've seen this with my own eyes. In some countries where you have a large number of orphans. إِنَّمَا يَأْكُلُونَ فِي بُطُونِهِمْ نَارًا. Meaning that money that they take, they're not going to see any blessing from it. And on the day of judgment, they shall be punished for it. So number one is having foresight. How do we become proactive? And we'll come later as to how Yusuf was proactive when it came to his challenges that he faced instead of being reactive. One part of being proactive is to anticipate results before they happen. And number two is to understand consequences. Now, sometimes consequences are a result of natural law. For instance, if somebody decides to throw themselves from the top of a building, what's the consequence? The consequence is that they are going to fall. Once they choose to throw themselves off that building, they're not subject to their own choice anymore. They can't say stop and stop themselves. Now they are subject to what? To the laws of nature, to the laws of gravity. And we can't, at least not yet, with all of the advancements that we haven't figured out a way to suspend the laws of gravity completely in our natural state. But to understand, even though sometimes we talk about consequences in a way that it's not in my control because consequences are from natural law, however, that choice to step off of that building was your choice. And that's why when we talk about punishment, when we talk about the philosophical basis of understanding punishment, when it comes to consequences, yes, maybe the consequence is not within your control. However, the choice that led to the consequence is within your control. That's why we talk about the punishment or the reward for the choices, not only for the consequences. So for instance, when you come across the narration that says, من سن سنة حسنة فله أجرها وأجر من عمل بها إلى يوم القيامة ومن سن سنة سيئة فعليه وزرها ووزر من عمل بها إلى يوم القيامة. He who introduces a good practice within a community, within a society, shall reap the rewards and the rewards of everybody who practices that practice until the day of judgment. And likewise the opposite. He who introduces an evil practice. That's why we have to really be careful of what we do. And we'll come to this, is when people say, do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting anybody. Why? Ethically, this does not make sense. Philosophically, this does not make sense. Those who introduce an evil practice shall also reap the rewards until the day of judgment. Now you may say, it was out of my control. It was out of my control that this person on the other side of the globe did evil because of me. No, you had the choice initially to introduce that practice of good or evil. Even when it comes to good, imagine if someone does something good and says, no, I don't want anybody to do good anymore because of me. It's not your choice. You did the good, and now people are following in your practice. That's why it's about the choice more than it is about the consequences. But that's why we have to understand the relationship between choices and consequences. We have to have foresight, and we have to know that everything that we do today has consequences. When you pick up one side of the stick, you also pick up the other side of the stick. And this leads us to the second point, is do anything that you want as long as you don't hurt anybody. How many times have we heard this? Whatever you want, go ahead. Do whatever you want. You're not hurting anybody. Now, first of all, if we're to address this question ethically and philosophically, who determines what is hurt and what is not hurt? If I choose, for instance, to get on a motorcycle without a helmet, and I say I'm not hurting anybody. Many people, they have this attitude, I'm not hurting anybody. Well, I may be a professional rider, I may be careful, and I may not hurt myself. But what about the person who is an amateur rider, who may look at me and take after my example? So how do we even determine what is hurt? Who determines what is hurt? Is it the individual or is it the society? Because if it's the individual that determines what is hurt, then the world will be run by everybody's whims. This person has an opinion who is different from that person's opinion, who is different from that person's opinions. There will be as many definitions as the word hurt as there are as people's opinions. Does society define what hurt is? No, because sometimes a society in itself, an entire society, is doing wrong. Look at Nazi Germany. Everybody was doing one thing. Does that mean that it was right? So how do we determine what is hurt? Instead of thinking about don't hurt anybody or do it as long as you don't hurt anybody, instead of following those kinds of ethics and those kinds of philosophies, we need to follow principles. When we follow principles, we make sure that we're doing the right thing. Why? Because principles are universal. We mentioned this the other day. Principles are universal. Principles are also time-tested. For instance, something cannot be a principle if it's not time-tested. Even if a lot of people practice it, if it's not time-tested, it does not become a principle. So some principles are like what? The Quran speaks about principles. Justice. Justice is a principle. Truthfulness. Honesty. Those are all principles. That's one thing. Another thing is when we're talking about hurt, yes, sometimes we don't hurt others, but we may hurt ourselves. This is what the Quran refers to as ظلم النفس. Sometimes we engage in ظلم النفس. For instance, the people of Musa, after they crossed the ocean, after they were saved from Fir'aun, after they followed Musa, within a few days they abandoned worshipping God and they began to worship idols. The Quran says they came across a group of people, they saw them worshipping idols, they told Musa, let us have an idol like them so that we can worship them. Within only a few days, within only a few weeks. When Musa left in order to receive the when he went to receive the revelation from Allah, he came back and he saw them worshipping a calf, ijl. And he said to them, Ya qawm, innakum zalamtum anfusakum bittikhadikum al-ijl. That, O people, you haven't oppressed me, Musa is saying. You haven't oppressed God. You have oppressed yourself because you have decided for yourself that you shall abandon. And even when we decide to abandon, if we are followers of God, if we're not followers of God, this is a different discussion. But if we are followers of God, we have to understand that when we engage in dhulm al-nafs, when we oppress ourselves, that is also not acceptable. Because everything that God has given us, which is our body, which is our heart, which is our mind, our intellect, all of that is an amana. It is a protection. We have to make sure that we are protecting it from dhulm. We have to make sure that we are protecting it from oppression. Another point is the point of leadership. Each and every single one of us, in some way or another, is a leader. A leader isn't simply the person that sits on the pulpit, or the person that leads the prayer, or the person who has a designated title. Some people, they pride themselves on their title. The more acronyms they can rack up on the title, the more authority that they have. This is not true leadership. Leadership is a position of influence. And every person has the capacity for leadership. When you look at the first two people that God created, Adam and Hawa, one of them was the leader. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a big group in order to be a leader. The leader is the person who is of authority and influence. And a leader can also be the first person to do anything. That's why when you talk about companies, for instance, they say that this company is a leader in the field of transportation, or it's a leader in the field of medicine, meaning that this is the first company to explore certain avenues. When we consider this, we stop thinking in terms of do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anybody. Why? Because we take into consideration the fact that people are watching us. When you look at a family, the father is usually the leader, but doesn't have to be the leader. Sometimes the mother can be the leader. Sometimes the son or the daughter can be the leader. The person who is paving the path of influence. The one who others are following in their example, that is the leader. So when we take that into consideration, we stop thinking so much about what I want and what is good for other people. Because you start thinking, well, other people are watching me. Other people may pick up this habit. And maybe I stay safe by not putting on my helmet. But if somebody else is watching me, I can endanger that person's life. Even if I have good intentions. And that's why understanding our capacity for leadership is also important. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the women of the Prophet in the Quran. He says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Ya nisa an-nabi, man ya'ti min kunna bifahishatin mubayyina, يضاعف لها العذاب ضعفين وكان ذلك على الله يسيرا. O woman of the Prophet, whichever one of you comes forth with an evil deed, she shall be punished twice. And also the opposite is true. وَمَنْ يَقْنُتْ مِنْ كُنَّ لِلَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ وَتَعْمَلْ صَالِحًا نُؤْتِهَا أَجْرَهَا مَرَّتَيْنِ. That whenever you do good, we shall also reward you twofold. Why? Because you are in the spotlight. Because other women, they look up to you as role models. That's why there needs to be an emphasis on leadership on what we do. You can't say, I'm going to do something and it's not going to hurt anybody. Other people are looking up to you. Now, the question is, if other people are not looking up to you, does it make it right? You still have the relationship between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, Yusuf, it is said that one day it was asked to Yaqub that, why is Yusuf your favorite son? Why did you favor Yusuf over his brothers? And his reply is, one day I gave a task to all of my sons to take an animal, a small animal, and to go and slaughter, to find somewhere where nobody can see them, and to slaughter it. So they all came back and they had slaughtered, except for Yusuf. He said, why didn't you slaughter Yusuf? He said, you told me to go somewhere where nobody can see over me. And everywhere I went, I saw that God was watching over me, so I couldn't complete it. So knowing that God is watching us every time, and people are watching our example, and sometimes we're confused on how to teach with our example. Sometimes you just have to set the right example. You don't have to say anything. There's a story which most of you or all of you have probably heard from the life of Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein alayhum as-salam, when they were younger and they came across a man who was not performing his wudu properly. So they decided that instead of telling him, because even though they were the grandsons of the Prophet, but they were children at that time. You know, it's tough for a child to teach an adult by telling them to do something. Even if they're right, maybe that adult will not take it. I'm supposed to learn from a child. We all have egos. We're protective of our egos. So what did they do? They came up with a plan that one of them was going to perform the wudu in front of the other. He was going to make a mistake and the other would correct him. And they would do it in full view of this man. And so that's what they did. And that's how they taught the man how to correct his way of doing wudu. So people are watching us. So Yusuf, going back to the story of Yusuf, he was proactive in that he could have blamed everybody. However, he decided to work within his own circle of influence. And this idea is that each and every single one of us, in order to be proactive, we have a circle of influence. We work from the inside out instead of outside in. What does that mean? Each and every single one of us, we have a circle of influence. There are things in our life which we can influence. Outside of that circle of influence, so if you imagine two concentric circles, one circle and then a larger circle which is outside. The smaller circle on the inside we'll call the circle of influence. The larger circle on the outside we'll call the circle of concern. So the circle of concern is things which we are concerned about, but they're not within our influence, such as what? You may be concerned about things which are going on in the world right now. Politics, halfway across the world. Things which you know you cannot influence. So what do? You work, effective people, instead of always worrying about the things that are outside of their circle of influence, they worry about the things which are inside their circle of influence, and they work inside out, and they expand their circle of influence. And this is exactly what the case with Yusuf was. How? Outside of his influence was what? People's behavior, his brother's behavior. Zulaykha, what she did to him, that wasn't his choice. That was something that was her choice. What was in his circle of influence? His choices, how he was going to respond, his attitude, his behavior. All of that are within our choices. Sometimes people make the claim that this person makes me angry. Do you know what that means? That means that you have no control over your emotions. Do you know how ridiculous that sounds when you say this person makes me angry? No. You decided to be angry. Maybe they had certain behavior. You can't change their behavior. But it was your choice that made you angry. That's why when we talk about happiness, you may hear this all the time, that they say happiness is a choice. It truly is a choice. Being miserable is also a choice. We always have the ability to control what's in our circle of influence. Yusuf, he took a proactive approach. He controlled what was in his influence. When she tried to seduce him and advance towards him, he didn't say, I can't handle myself. I have to engage in sin. He handled himself. He ran away. And when it became apparent that she was the perpetrator, all she wanted him to do was admit that it was his guilt. And he was looking at two options. Admit his guilt, which was wrong, because he didn't commit it, or choose prison. What did he say? قال رب السجن أحب إلي مما يدعونني إليه. I would rather take prison for these many years rather than accept their judgment. Everything was his choice, even though the consequence was what? Prison. And he unjustly went to prison. But he understood that he needed to work within his own circle of influence. He did not want to violate his, again, this goes back to principles. He did not want to violate his principle of truthfulness. And when we know what we stand for, when we have principles and when we know what we stand for, they say that when you don't stand for anything, you will fall for anything. However, when you actually stand for something, and most people, they don't know what they stand for because they've never asked themselves, what are my principles and what are my values? Have you ever asked yourself this? What are my principles? What are my values? It's all in the Quran if you read the Quran. That's where we derive our principles and our values from. The Quran says that no matter what happens on the outside, no matter what people do to you, you always have the choice to do good. وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَنْ لَا تَعْدِلُوا اعْدِلُوا هُوَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى. Do not allow those evildoers, people who do evil towards you, do not allow them to get inside your head. Do not allow them to change your course of action, to deviate your course of action, and to deviate you from the path of adala, justice, adl. وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَنْ لَا تَعْدِلُوا اعْدِلُوا هُوَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى. Meaning that you always have a choice. You can't say this person forced me to do this or this person forced me to do that. You always have a choice. Let's take this in, brothers and sisters. Understand that our prosperity, our success, our happiness, our joy, that's something that has to be there, that has to come from within. It has to be a choice. We cannot always depend on other people to make us happy. That has to come from within. And that's why we talk about proactivity versus reactivity. What are some of the things that I can control? My behavior, what I say, my tongue. You know, it's said that when the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when his son Ibrahim passed away, Ibrahim was around the same age of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Some narrations tell us that one day the Prophet had both Ibrahim and Hussein on his lap. And Jibreel came to the Prophet. He said, Ya Rasulullah, God has decreed that one of these two shall not live. And you have the choice. Which one shall not live and which one shall continue? And, you know, when we think about it, we say this is an unfair choice. When we think about it with our own minds. Because we're always thinking about what's fair and what's unfair. The prophets, they didn't think in the same way. Do you notice that the prophets, they thought on a different level? The imams, they thought on a different level because their attitudes were different. They looked at things differently. So the Prophet said, if this must be a choice, then keep Hussein with me. Because I cannot stand to see Hussein, my dear Hussein, be taken away from me. Even though Ibrahim was also very dear to him. So when Ibrahim passed away, it is said that they were walking in the funeral procession. And some people, they noticed that the Prophet was not weeping. You know, when a loved one passes away, we weep. We tend to weep. They saw that the Prophet was not crying. He was not weeping. So they asked him, they said, Ya Rasulullah, don't you feel pain in your heart? And he pointed to the mountain. He said that if this mountain knew the pain that was in my heart, it would crumble. If it knew what was in my heart. And then the Prophet said, one of his famous narrations, he says, إِنَّ الْعَيْنَ لَتَدْمَعْ وَالْقَلْبَ لَيَحْزَنْ. He says that sometimes our tears, they are drawn. Sometimes you see something and you can't control your tears. Have you ever seen a scene in a movie, for instance, or in a play, and you can't control yourself? Even though you know that it is fiction, it's not real life, but you begin to cry, you weep. Or you've seen someone take advantage of somebody else and you cry, you weep, even if you don't know who that person is. Sometimes it's involuntary. وَالْقَلْبَ لَيَحْزَنْ. Sometimes your heart breaks as well and you can't control it. He says, however, in his hadith, however, he says, we never say that which displeases our Lord. Meaning what? Meaning that sometimes you can't control where your heart goes or when your tears flow. But one thing that you can always control is your tongue. You can always control what you say. And some people, unfortunately, when tragedy strikes, they lose it. They begin to swear. Some of them begin to disbelieve. How many of you know people who they disbelieve? They begin to utter words of disbelief and kufr just because something bad has happened in their life. And then they apologize and regret and say, it wasn't in my control. What you say is always in your control. Every single moment is always in control. So understanding and taking ownership, this is what Imam Hussein was about. The message of Ashura is about being responsible. And if we truly want to model what Imam Hussein alayhi salam did, we would become accountable for our lives, become responsible for our choices and for our consequences. See, going back to the story of Yusuf, what does he say? He says, and I mentioned this in passing the other day, finally when he meets his family, he says, وَقَدْ أَحْسَنَ بِي إِذْ أَخْرَجَنِي مِنَ السِّجْنِ. He says, God has been gracious to me after all these years, that He brought me out of the prison. He didn't say God put me in prison, I blame God. God brought me out of the prison. وَقَدْ أَحْسَنَ بِي إِذْ أَخْرَجَنِي مِنَ السِّجْنِ وَجَاءَ بِكُم مِّنَ الْبَدْوِ مِن بَعْدِ أَن نَزَغَ الشَّيْطَانُ بَيْنِي وَبَيْنَ إِخْوَتِي. God has been so gracious to me that He brought me out of prison, that He brought my family from a far land away, and that He brought them even after the shaitan got between me and my brothers. Never once did Yusuf blame his brothers, even though his brothers were at fault. They threw him in the well, which caused him to be sold into slavery, which caused him to be in the home of the minister, which caused him to be in jail for more than a decade, which caused him all of that distraught and all of that tragedy. He never once blamed anybody. It was his language, it was his attitude. وَقَدْ أَحْسَنَ بِي إِذْ أَخْرَجَنِي مِنَ السِّجْنِ وَجَاءَ بِكُم مِّنَ الْبَدْوِ مِن بَعْدِ أَن نَزَغَ الشَّيْطَانُ بَيْنِي وَبَيْنَ إِخْوَتِي. So this is the language of someone who is responsible, someone who is accountable. Likewise, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he didn't complain and say, I was just dealt a bad card. If only my brother, God forbid, if only my brother had negotiated better, if only my father had fought harder, if only my grandfather had done this. Did you ever see this language from Imam Hussein alayhi salam? Did you ever see him say, if only I had 1,000 more supporters? Rather, he said, there are no companions as good as my companions. Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he took ownership, even though the decay of the Muslim ummah was not his fault. However, he still took ownership. And sometimes things, brothers and sisters, happen in our lives. It's not our fault. That's understandable. But sometimes we still take ownership because it's the responsible thing to do. It's the proactive thing to do. And if we really want to lead our communities and our children in the right direction, we have to learn proactivity and taking responsibility and taking ownership sometimes of consequences which are unintended. And Imam Hussein alayhi salam could have said, fine, I will pledge allegiance to Yazid, and that'll be the end of it. However, that wasn't the right thing to do. That wasn't the model of leadership that he wanted to keep behind for generations. Now we honor Imam Hussein, and we'll talk about this tomorrow, is why is Ashura relevant and why do we honor him? To remind ourselves. Because he made a choice that perpetuated for eternity, for hundreds of years, for thousands of years. He could have laid back and said, it's not my fault. And if he would have done that, we would not know anything about Islam today. Or we would have a very, very warped version of Islam. We don't even want to think about what it would have been. However, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and he understood fully his choices and the consequences of those choices. Tonight is the night, brothers and sisters, we remember Ali al-Akbar, the first from among the family of Imam Hussein alayhi salam to go out into the battlefield. And narrations tell us that Ali al-Akbar was very similar in his demeanor, in his character, in the way he walked, in the way he spoke to his grandfather, Rasulullah. كان أشبه الناس خلقا وخلقا ومنطقا برسول الله. And Imam Hussein says that when we كنا إذا اشتقنا, if we longed to see Rasulullah, نظرنا إلى وجه هذا الغلام, we would look into the face of this young man because he was so similar to the Prophet in his demeanor and his characteristics. And he was a young man who knew full well what was going on. He wasn't confused. From the first day he knew what was going on. He was well aware. And narrations tell us that when Imam Hussein and his family were headed towards Karbala, one narration says that Imam Hussein, as he was riding on the horse or the camel that was taking them in that direction, he kept falling asleep and waking up. And every time he would say, لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله, لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله, لا إله إلا الله. He would do tasbih. And so Ali al-Akbar, he saw that his father kept saying, لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. So he turned to his father, he said, Abatah. He says, I see that you are frequenting the saying, لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. He says, is something wrong? Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he says, no, I am just seeing a vision that we are going towards that final destination of ours. So Ali al-Akbar, imagine the conviction he had in his heart. He said, Abatah, my dear father, أَوَلَسْنَا عَلَى الْحَقِّ? Are we not on the path of truth? Imam Hussein replied, yes, Bala, yes we are. So Ali al-Akbar said, إِذَنْ لَا نُبَالِي. إِذَنْ لَا نُبَالِي. It does not matter. وَقَعْنَا عَلَى الْمَوْتِ أَمْ وَقَعَ الْمَوْتُ عَلَيْنَا. It doesn't matter whether death befalls us or we fall upon death. Why? Because we know of our consequence. We know our destination. It doesn't matter what happens in between. It doesn't matter that we have to fight, because we know what our destination is. This was a young man of conviction. This is a young man who understood the concept of action and consequences. And on that day when Imam Hussein alayhi salam calls, ألا هل من ناصر ينصرنا ألا هل من معين يعيننا, Ali al-Akbar is the first to go out into the battlefield. Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he prepares Ali al-Akbar, and as he is sending him out into the battlefield, he turns to Umar ibn Sa'ad and he says, Oh Umar, may Allah bereave you in the same way that you are attempting to bereave me. May Allah send to you someone who will kill you in your sleep because of how you are bereaving me. And then he recited the verse, إِنَّ اللَّهَ اصْطَفَى آدَمَ وَنُوحًا وَآلَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ وَآلَ عِمْرَانَ عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ ذُرِّيَّةٌ بَعْضُهَا مِنْ بَعْضٍ وَاللَّهُ سَمِيعٌ عَلِيمٌ اللهم اشهد عليهم. O Allah, bear witness upon them. فإنه قد برز إليهم غلام أشبه الناس خلقا وخلقا ومنطقا برسولك. O Allah, bear witness upon these people that this young man who is going out to the battlefield is the one who is most similar to Rasulullah. And when we were longing for Rasulullah, we would look to the face of this young man. Ali al-Akbar, he went out into the battlefield. He introduced himself, the first member of the family to go out. He introduced himself. He said, أنا علي بن الحسين بن علي نحن ورب البيت أولى بالنبي أضربكم بالسيف حتى ينثني ضرب غلام هاشمي علوي تالله لا يحكم فينا ابن الدعي. I am Ali, the son of Ali, the son of Hussein, the son of Ali. We are closer to the Prophet than these people. And by God, the one whose father is not known shall not rule above us, meaning Yazid, the one whose father is not known. And he went out into the battlefield. Layla, the mother of Ali al-Akbar, she was in the tent. And she was sitting in the tent. However, she was looking from inside the tent towards the face of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, because he was watching his son in the battlefield. All of a sudden, the face, as he was fighting valiantly in the battlefield, the face of Abu Abdullah began to change. Layla, she looked to Abu Abdullah, she said, Sayyidi Abu Abdullah, hal usiba waladi bishay? Has something happened to my son? Now I have noticed your facial expression has changed. She says, no. He says to her, no, nothing has changed except for the fact that a warrior has come out into the battlefield and I fear for the safety of my son. He says, go inside and do dua for your son that he returns, for I have heard Rasulullah say that the supplication of a mother is accepted for her son. So she kept inside the tent and she turned to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She began to make the dua, Ya Radda Yusuf ila Ya'qub. O he who brought back Yusuf to Ya'qub. O the one who removed the calamity from Ayub. Urdud alayya waladi, bring back to me my son. It was only a few months later that Ali al-Akbar, he comes back to his father. He says, Sayyidi Aba Abdullah, he begins to complain. He says, Sayyidi Aba Abdullah al-Atash qatalani wa thiqlu al-hadidi ajhadani. I am so thirsty. I do not have that much energy to go out anymore into the battlefield. Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he shows him, the narration says, he reveals to his son his tongue, which was like a dry piece of wood. When Ali al-Akbar sees how thirsty his father was, he returns back into the battlefield. He begins to fight with full force, with full bravery. At that moment, ya mu'mineen, it is said that he was upon his horse out into the battlefield. One of the soldiers from the enemy army, he launches a spear which lands into the chest of Ali al-Akbar. All of them, they begin to surround Ali al-Akbar. They begin to strike him. The strikes begin to come from all around him. The blood, the narration says, the blood begins to gush from his head. It falls upon the eyes of the horse. And the horse, instead of bringing him back to the camp of Hussein, it takes him towards the camp of Umar ibn Sa'ad. All of a sudden, the enemies, they begin to surround him from every corner, from every direction. They begin to rain down upon him with arrows and swords. At that moment, he calls upon his father, Sayyidi Aba Abdullah. Imam Hussein alayhi salam rushes out into the battlefield. He sees his son in this case. He sees his son on the battlefield. He is bloodied from head to toe. Bunayya Ali ala dunya ba'daka al-afa. My dear son Ali, this life is not worth living after you. And then he takes his cheek and he places it upon the cheek of his son. Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين وصلوا على محمد وآل محمد.